This is me inside Huawei's headquarters 7 years ago in China. Walking through the campus with 60,000 employees and seeing the scale of the tech, it really felt a lot less like a company and more like this blueprint for the world's next big tech giant. But just a year later, everything changed. The US slammed Huawei with sanctions, cut it off from the world's most advanced chips, and encouraged other countries to ban its 5G equipment. Basically overnight, what looked unstoppable suddenly seemed doomed. But fast forward to today, and Huawei controls nearly a third of the global telecom market. Its phones are amongst the highest selling in China again. They're even selling cars now, and it's unveiling new technology to take on Nvidia. So the question here is, how does a company go from being sanctioned by the United States, the world's most powerful country, to staging one of the most unlikely comebacks we've ever seen? To understand Huawei's comeback, you need to remember how it started in the first place and why it's so controversial amongst American politicians. See, Huawei was founded in 1987 in Shenzhen by this man. He was an engineer who worked in the People's Liberation Army's engineering corps. But then he left the military and started with about 21,000 yuan, which was roughly about $5,000 at the time. The company's first real product wasn't a smartphone or even a base station. It was a simple hotel switch, basically the box that connects telephones in guest rooms. Now, at the time, rural China desperately needed telecom gear. While Western companies were only focused on big cities, Huawei jumped into the gap. The founder pushed a culture of trying things to break things and build things, and in the 1990s, he even brought in IBM to help shape Huawei's systems for supply chain, R&D, and quality. And that discipline, combined with China's massive infrastructure build-out, turned Huawei into a national leader in networking gear. And this was way before the glory years of its smartphone. Now, one of the most interesting things about this company that a lot of people don't actually know is this concept of the rotating chairperson. And I learned this while I was on their campus. They have 3 senior leaders take turns leading the company for 6 months at a time. The idea behind this is actually coming from nature. Think of birds flying in that V formation. They rotate who flies at the front so no one gets too tired, and then the whole group can go together farther. Huawei applies the same logic. By rotating leadership, no single executive outside the founder holds permanent control, and it keeps the company flexible, balanced, and less dependent on one person. So how did Huawei get so big? By the late 2010s, Huawei wasn't just a phone brand, it had become the world's largest telecom equipment vendor, a title that it still holds today. In 2023, research firm Del Oro estimated that Huawei captured around 30% of global telecom equipment revenue. Now, that's more than Nokia and Ericsson combined, even with heavy US pressure against it. Huawei reported almost $100 billion in revenue for 2023, and the company says that about a quarter of that, almost $23 billion, went straight into research and development. So more than half of Huawei's employees actually work in R&D. That's a huge investment, and it ended up playing a huge role in the company's future. So hold on here, why exactly did the US sanction Huawei over other companies? Well, largely because people don't really actually know who owns this company. See, Huawei says it's an employee-owned company through an internal shareholding plan, with the founder holding only about 1 to 2%. But here's the catch. Legally, those employee shares are registered under a trade union committee inside the company. And that setup is very different from how Western companies do it, and it's why outsiders often say Huawei's true ownership is murky and hard to pin down. But it's not just about who holds the shares. Western governments also worry about China's 2017 National Intelligence Law, whose Article 7 says that all organizations and citizens shall support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence efforts. Now, Huawei says it would never backdoor networks, but critics say the law leaves no choice if asked. And that tension, perception versus legal reality, is the core of the security debate here. The same debate that led the UK and other countries to order Huawei out of 5G cores and eventually 5G networks. So in 2019, the US puts Huawei on the entity list, and that move blocked the company from using American tech, including Google mobile services. Now, how can you use your Huawei phone if you can't get your apps from the Android store? That was the challenge it suddenly faced. But the bigger hit came in 2020 when Washington tightened rules on chip making tools, which made it nearly impossible for Huawei to get advanced processors. Now, see, most companies design their own chips, but they don't manufacture them. Instead, they rely on foundries, those massive factories like TSMC in Taiwan or Samsung in South Korea. They are the ones that build the chips. And those factories depend heavily on US equipment. But once the restrictions kicked in, they couldn't legally supply Huawei anymore. The result was devastating. Huawei's premium smartphone business collapsed. Soon after, countries in Europe and other allies began banning or ripping out Huawei gear entirely. Okay, so Huawei is cut off from Google services, so what does it do? Launch its own. It launched Harmony OS and leaned into its own app store, App Gallery. Now, it's easy to dismiss a homegrown operating system until you see the scale. By 2022, Huawei reported 580 million monthly active users on App Gallery, positioning it as a top 3 global app marketplace. And in the first quarter of 2024, Harmony OS overtook iOS in China to become second behind Android. That is a big deal. Is App Gallery global like Google Play? No, not really. The center of gravity is China, but all of this raw adoption shows that Huawei built its own version very fast for China. So then in August 2023, Huawei shocks everyone by quietly launching the Mate 60 Pro. When people tore it apart, they found a new chip inside called the Kirin 9000S. Now, this was built in China by the chip maker SMIC. Now, here's why that mattered. Most people thought China couldn't make chips this advanced under US sanctions. Now, the technology used here wasn't the cutting-edge gear from Taiwan's TSMC, but it was still good enough. Yes, the yields, meaning how many working chips you get per batch, may have been lower, but the symbolic win here was huge. Washington was stunned, Beijing celebrated, and Chinese consumers, they bought the phone like crazy. Even within limits, China had proved in this case that it could still push out competitive chips for its own flagship phones. And that led the US to tighten restrictions even further on SMIC, trying to block its most advanced chip factories. So did sanctions fail on Huawei, or did they work as intended? Well, it depends on the real goal here, because if the goal was to slow Huawei and signal consequences, then yes, sanctions worked. Huawei lost global Android phones, many 5G markets, and key suppliers. So yes, it did work. But if the goal here was to stop Huawei and China from climbing up the tech ladder, it did the opposite in a way because it forced it to innovate on its own. By 2023, Huawei's revenues bounced back. Its telecom gear dominance persisted, and its smartphone share in China surged, narrowing Apple's premium lead. This is all a case study in the limits of sanctions, when the target has scale, state support, and a vast home market. So how does Huawei make money today? Well, remember, Huawei is not just a phone company. Most of its revenue still comes from telecom networks. It also earns from cloud services, digital power projectors. It's now doing cars and so many consumer devices. Last year, Huawei had revenue of $118 billion, and the company also holds more than 140,000 patents worldwide. It is funding many bets at the same time, in cloud, in cars, and green energy. So why did so many countries ban Huawei's 5G? Now, most bans were not based on auditors finding a secret backdoor. They were just based on risk. If a company is based in a country where the government can legally demand cooperation from its tech firms, do you want that company building your critical networks? I mean, imagine smart cities where everything is connected and cars are driving themselves. If all that tech is built by companies connected to Chinese government who could maybe be your enemy one day, well, that's a big risk. Countries like Iceland said, yes, we like your technology, we'll use it. Well, the UK said no. It banned new Huawei 5G gear after December 2020 and ordered that existing equipment be removed in upcoming years. Sweden and several other countries followed with similar moves, while other countries just shrugged their shoulders. Many countries in Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia kept working with Huawei. So the world split. Huawei insists that it's independent, but many governments are just not willing to gamble on it. So what is Huawei today and what's next? Well, at its core, it's still the world's biggest telecom gear maker, and that steady stream of revenue is funding everything else, like all of that R&D. Its phones continue to make a comeback. The Mate and the P series are selling again, powered by homegrown chips and boosted by national pride. And then, of course, Harmony OS. In China, it's become the #2 mobile system behind Android. And if it keeps growing, Huawei can continue to build a parallel universe of apps and services that never actually touch Google. Behind all of this is relentless research. Huawei spends more than 23% of its revenue on R&D, and that's money that is now going into AI, infrastructure, and so much more. Huawei is no longer about just being a phone brand. It's about whether a sanctioned national champion can build a full alternative tech stack, talking about chips, operating system, app stores, cloud services, cars, and even power grids. In 2019, that sounded impossible, but now it looks more realistic, at least inside China and across many Belt and Road markets. But around the world, obstacles here remain. Export controls still squeeze chip production. Western countries are ripping out Huawei equipment and encouraging other countries to do the same. So while the US has slowed Huawei down, the sanctions also hardened the company's resolve and pushed China's tech industry to grow faster. In the end, Huawei's strategy is clear: dominate at home, expand in the global south, and use money and time to come up with new inventions. If Harmony OS keeps its lead over Apple's iOS in China, and if Chinese chipmakers can scale production even with lower efficiency, then the next few years will not just test Huawei. It will test whether the world can split into two competing tech universes.